Have you ever wondered why some people walk through life feeling strangely out of place, not because they are broken, but because they were never meant to fit into ordinary patterns? They enter a room and quietly alter its atmosphere without speaking a word. They make others feel exposed without asking a single question. Their presence invites admiration from some, discomfort from others, and unexplained hostility from those who sense something they cannot define. Carl Jung believed that certain individuals carry a psychological structure so uncommon that the collective unconscious struggles to categorize them. Such a personality is not a reward. It is not a blessing wrapped in comfort. More often, it is a burden disguised as destiny. A rare personality begins its journey in silence. Long before strength becomes visible, it survives misunderstanding. As children, these women often notice what others ignore. They sense tension hidden behind polite smiles. They hear pain beneath ordinary conversations. They recognize contradictions before anyone else acknowledges them. Adults dismiss these observations as imagination. Friends call them too sensitive. Family members encourage them to become more practical, less emotional, less intense. Yet what the world calls sensitivity is often heightened perception. Jung described the unconscious as an ocean beneath consciousness, constantly influencing thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Most people glance only at the surface of this ocean. A rare personality lives close enough to hear the waves beneath it. She notices the invisible currents shaping every interaction. This perception is not magical. It is psychological awareness sharpened through experience. And that awareness becomes the first sign. She cannot comfortably accept illusions. Most people survive through carefully constructed stories. They convince themselves relationships are healthy when they are built upon fear. They call emotional dependence love. They confuse approval with belonging. Entire communities reinforce these comforting myths because truth demands transformation. But the rare woman feels physical discomfort around deception. Even when everyone agrees with the illusion, something inside refuses cooperation. You may have experienced this yourself. Perhaps everyone praised someone you instinctively distrusted. Months later, hidden manipulation emerged exactly as you quietly sensed. Maybe you walked away from opportunities others envied because something invisible felt wrong. At the time, your decision appeared irrational. Only later did reality reveal what intuition had already perceived. This is not coincidence. The unconscious gathers thousands of subtle details that conscious awareness cannot immediately organize. Facial expressions lasting less than a second. Contradictory tones hidden beneath confident language. Body movements disconnected from spoken promises. Your mind collects these fragments before your logic catches up. Jung believed intuition is often unconscious perception becoming conscious feeling. The rare personality learns to trust this inner signal, even when logic temporarily disagrees. Because truth eventually catches up with intuition. The second sign appears in loneliness. Not ordinary loneliness caused by isolation. A deeper loneliness born from psychological difference. The world encourages adaptation. Blend in. Avoid conflict. Become predictable. Fit expectations. Smile when necessary. Stay agreeable. But individuation, the central journey of Jungian psychology, diverges in the opposite direction. It demands becoming who you truly are rather than who society rewards. Few willingly accept this path. The rare personality cannot escape it. As she becomes more authentic, invitations quietly disappear, conversations grow superficial, certain friendships dissolve without dramatic endings. Romantic partners become uncomfortable with her increasing emotional clarity. She no longer performs the version of herself designed for acceptance. The cost feels enormous. There are evenings when silence becomes the only companion capable of understanding. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. A rare woman eventually realizes solitude colors the soul differently than constant approval. Solitude sharpens perception. It removes distraction. It forces direct confrontation with the unconscious. This is why loneliness eventually transforms into peace. Not because people disappear. Because dependence does. The third sign is impossible to imitate. She makes others confront themselves. Without criticism. Without intention. Without even realizing it. People reveal astonishing amounts about themselves around psychologically integrated individuals. The insecure become competitive. The manipulative become restless. The narcissistic become strangely obsessed. Emotionally mature people become deeply comfortable. Why? Projection. One of Jung's greatest psychological discoveries. Every human projects hidden qualities onto others. We see in people what already exists within ourselves, whether acknowledged or denied. A rare personality becomes an unusually clear psychological mirror. Someone carrying unresolved shame interprets her confidence as arrogance. Someone hiding envy experiences her success as personal attack. Someone avoiding authenticity feels threatened by her honesty. She has done nothing. Yet emotional reactions explode around her. This often confuses her during youth. She asks herself what she did wrong. The answer is often nothing. People are reacting to reflections of themselves. Seneca warned that people are disturbed less by reality than by their judgments of reality. Projection is exactly this. Judgment replacing observation. Once understood, life changes forever. The rare woman stops carrying responsibility for emotions she did not create. She responds with compassion instead of self-blame. Because mirrors never manufacture the image. They only reveal it. The fourth sign grows slowly through pain. She stops chasing validation. Most personalities construct identity through external mirrors. Praise becomes confidence. Attention becomes value. Relationships become evidence of worth. When approval disappears, identity collapses. But repeated disappointment teaches the rare woman something profound. Validation is unstable. Today's admiration becomes tomorrow's criticism. Today's loyalty becomes tomorrow's abandonment. If identity depends upon external opinion, peace becomes impossible. Jung insisted that individuation requires withdrawing psychological energy from collective expectations. In simple words, your worth cannot belong to the crowd. It must belong to your own soul. This transformation rarely happens comfortably. Usually betrayal begins it. Sometimes rejection. Sometimes heartbreak. Sometimes years of invisible emotional exhaustion. Eventually something breaks. Not the woman. The illusion. She discovers an astonishing freedom. People are allowed to misunderstand her. People are allowed to leave. People are allowed to choose someone else. None of these events determine her value. For the first time, breathing feels different. Not because life became easier. Because identity became internal. The rare personality is not fearless. She simply fears self-betrayal more than rejection. That difference changes every decision thereafter. And strangely, the less she needs approval, the more authentic respect begins finding her naturally. Not because she pursued admiration, but because authenticity possesses a quiet gravity impossible to counterfeit. There comes a moment when the rare personality begins to notice a pattern that others dismiss as coincidence. Certain people become deeply attached after only a few conversations, while others develop an unexplained dislike almost immediately. Neutral reactions become uncommon. Indifference is rare. It is as though her presence quietly demands that every soul choose a side. Carl Jung would not have considered this mysterious. He would have called it the natural consequence of individuation. The more someone becomes psychologically whole, the more they disturb those who remain divided within themselves. This is the fifth sign. Your existence exposes hidden contradictions without uttering a single accusation. Imagine a woman who no longer apologizes for taking up emotional space. She listens carefully before speaking. She refuses to participate in gossip. She declines invitations that violate her peace. She no longer explains every decision in hopes of being understood. To an emotionally healthy person, these qualities inspire trust. To someone addicted to control, they feel like rebellion. To someone imprisoned by people-pleasing, they seem selfish. To someone who has spent a lifetime wearing masks, authenticity appears almost offensive. Nothing has changed except one thing. She has stopped negotiating with her own soul. That decision ripples outward. The collective unconscious resists transformation because every transformed individual reminds the group that change is possible. If one person chooses freedom, everyone else must unconsciously confront the question they have spent years avoiding. What excuse remains for staying asleep? This silent question is enough to create discomfort. That discomfort often disguises itself as criticism. People may call her distant, too intense, too difficult, too independent, too quiet, too confident, too emotional, too cold. Notice the contradiction. She becomes simultaneously too much and not enough, depending entirely on who is looking. The labels reveal far more about the observer than about the woman herself. Jung repeatedly emphasized that what irritates us in others can lead us toward understanding ourselves. Yet few people make that journey. Most simply attack the mirror. Perhaps you have experienced this strange paradox. The more honest you become, the fewer explanations seem necessary. The more peaceful you become, the more certain people accuse you of changing. The more boundaries you establish, the more others insist you have become difficult. In reality, you have not become more difficult. You have become less available for emotional exploitation. There is a profound difference. A rare personality slowly learns that peace is expensive. Not because it costs money. Because it costs illusions. It costs relationships built upon self-abandonment. It costs approval purchased through silence. It costs belonging that required pretending. The price feels unbearable at first. Until one day, pretending becomes even more painful than solitude. Then the choice becomes obvious. The sixth sign reveals itself in an unexpected way. You possess an unusual relationship with suffering. This does not mean life hurts less. Often it hurts more. The difference lies in what pain becomes. For most people, suffering ends as bitterness. For the rare personality, suffering gradually becomes understanding. This transformation is neither automatic nor romantic. It demands confronting the shadow. Jung described the shadow as every rejected part of the psyche, anger hidden beneath kindness, fear concealed by perfectionism, grief buried beneath achievement, vulnerability masked by endless competence. Most people spend their lives escaping these hidden chambers. The rare personality eventually walks into them willingly. Not because darkness feels comfortable. Because truth matters more than comfort. Imagine descending into an abandoned house where every locked room contains a forgotten version of yourself. The child who believed love had to be earned. The teenager who confused acceptance with silence. The young woman who tolerated disrespect because loneliness seemed worse. Each room waits patiently. Each memory whispers the same question. Will you finally look at me? Shadow work begins the moment the answer becomes yes. This is one of the hardest psychological journeys imaginable. There are no audiences applauding. No public recognition. No visible trophies. Only countless invisible moments where old survival patterns dissolve. The rare woman begins noticing something extraordinary. The anger she feared contains courage. The grief she resisted contains compassion. The fear she denied contains wisdom. Nothing inside her was evil. Much of it was simply abandoned. Healing, therefore, becomes less about becoming someone new, and more about welcoming home everyone she was forced to leave behind. Epictetus taught that freedom comes not from controlling events, but from mastering one's response to them. Shadow integration follows this same principle. The past cannot be rewritten, but its authority over the present can quietly disappear. There comes a day when an old trigger appears. Perhaps criticism. Perhaps rejection. Perhaps abandonment. Months earlier, it would have shattered her. Now, she notices it. Breathes. Observes. Responds instead of reacts. The trigger has not vanished. Its throne has. This is genuine psychological power. Not domination over others. Mastery over oneself. The seventh sign is perhaps the most misunderstood. You no longer crave constant certainty. The modern world worships certainty. People desperately seek guarantees before making decisions. Guaranteed love, Guaranteed success. Guaranteed acceptance. Guaranteed outcomes. Yet life refuses such promises. Jung understood that growth requires entering uncertainty consciously. He often described life as a dialogue between the known and the unknown. A rare personality gradually becomes comfortable living within that dialogue. She can begin again without seeing the entire path. She can release relationships whose endings make no immediate sense. She can remain patient while purpose unfolds slowly rather than demanding instant clarity. This does not mean she enjoys uncertainty. It means she trusts herself more than she trusts predictable circumstances. That distinction changes everything. Storms still arrive. Loss still visits. Disappointment still wounds. But beneath every external change exists an inner foundation no longer dependent upon perfect conditions. This is why others sometimes describe her as calm during chaos. They mistake emotional regulation for emotional absence. They cannot see the countless internal battles already fought long before the external storm appeared. The rare personality has practiced surviving invisible winters. Visible storms no longer seem impossible. And somewhere within this quiet resilience, something extraordinary begins to awaken. Not superiority. Not perfection. But an unshakable relationship with the deepest parts of her own soul. The eighth sign is the one few people recognize until it has already transformed an entire life. It is not extraordinary intelligence. It is not beauty. It is not charisma, success, or influence. It is the quiet realization that your identity no longer depends on becoming someone else. This is the destination Jung called individuation, not perfection, but wholeness. The world spends enormous energy convincing women that fulfillment lies just beyond the next achievement. Be thinner, be softer, be stronger, be more desirable, be more agreeable, be less emotional, be more ambitious. The demands contradict one another because they were never designed to bring peace. They were designed to keep identity dependent upon external approval. A rare personality eventually sees through this endless cycle. She no longer asks, "Who should I become so others will accept me?" She begins asking a far more dangerous question. Who have I always been beneath everyone else's expectations? That single question changes everything. Because once it is asked honestly, there is no comfortable return. Old masks begin to feel unbearably heavy. Conversations centered on appearances become exhausting. Competition loses its fascination. Comparison begins to dissolve. Not because she believes she is better than anyone else. Because she finally understands that every authentic soul follows a different path through the unconscious. No two journeys toward wholeness can ever look the same. This realization frees her from one of the greatest psychological prisons ever constructed, the need to measure herself against lives she was never meant to live. Perhaps you have already sensed this change within yourself. Maybe the dreams that once consumed you no longer seem important. The attention you once desperately sought now feels strangely empty. The arguments you once needed to win now seem insignificant. The people whose opinions once dictated your choices gradually lose their invisible authority. At first, this shift can feel frightening. Without the familiar voices telling you who to be, silence becomes overwhelming. But silence is never empty. Silence is where the unconscious finally has room to speak. Carl Jung believed that the symbols arising from dreams, intuition, and deep reflection were not random fragments of the mind. They were invitations from the self, the deepest center of the psyche, guiding a person toward greater integration. The rare personality begins to recognize these invitations, not as supernatural messages, but as subtle inner movements. A persistent feeling that a relationship has reached its natural ending. An unexpected desire to create instead of consume. A quiet certainty that forgiveness is no longer about excusing another person but releasing oneself from carrying their shadow. These inner movements rarely make logical sense at first. Yet they possess a strange consistency. Each one leads toward greater authenticity. Each one asks for greater courage. Each one requires surrendering another illusion. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Jung would likely have smiled at those words. Because every obstacle encountered by the rare personality ultimately becomes part of her psychological architecture. Rejection teaches discernment. Loss teaches detachment. Failure teaches humility. Betrayal teaches boundaries. Loneliness teaches self-companionship. Even grief becomes a teacher. Not because suffering is inherently beautiful, but because suffering honestly faced reshapes the soul in ways comfort never can. This is why the rare personality often appears softer with time rather than harder. Many expect pain to produce bitterness. Instead, true integration often produces compassion. Not naive compassion. Not endless tolerance. A wiser compassion. She understands that wounded people wound others because she has met the wounded places within herself. She understands that control often hides fear. That arrogance frequently conceals shame. That excessive perfectionism often masks terror of rejection. She sees beyond behavior into the hidden motivations beneath it. Yet something equally important has changed. Understanding no longer requires self-sacrifice. This is where many people become confused. Compassion is not permission. Empathy is not surrender. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. A psychologically integrated woman can understand another person's pain while still walking away from their destructive behavior. She can wish someone healing without volunteering to become their healer. She can love without abandoning herself. This is emotional maturity. It does not seek revenge. It does not seek validation. It does not seek applause. It simply chooses truth. And truth has an unmistakable quality. It becomes quieter with age. When the ego dominates, every disagreement feels like a threat. Every criticism feels like an attack. Every victory must be announced. But as individuation deepens, the need to perform gradually fades. Confidence no longer needs witnesses. Peace no longer requires explanation. Purpose no longer depends upon comparison. The rare personality begins to understand something that cannot be taught through books alone. The greatest transformation is invisible. The world may never notice the moment she stopped abandoning herself. No audience applauds when she chooses a healthy boundary instead of familiar chaos. No ceremony celebrates the day she forgives herself for surviving the only way she once knew how. No headlines announce the quiet afternoon when she finally realizes she no longer fears being misunderstood. Yet these invisible victories reshape an entire destiny. Because every external life is ultimately built upon an internal foundation. Change the foundation, and the future changes with it. Perhaps that is why rare personalities are so often misunderstood. People search for obvious signs of strength. They expect loud confidence, relentless ambition, constant certainty. Instead, genuine strength often arrives as quiet conviction. It appears in the woman who remains kind without becoming weak. Who remains open without becoming naive. Who remains humble without forgetting her worth. She no longer chases every opportunity. She chooses those aligned with her deepest values. She no longer argues with every misunderstanding. She allows truth to reveal itself through time. She no longer seeks to rescue everyone she meets. She understands that each soul must decide whether to begin its own journey toward wholeness. And perhaps this is the greatest paradox Jung ever revealed. The person who spends the least energy trying to become extraordinary often becomes unforgettable. Not because she demands attention. Because authenticity possesses a quiet gravity that no performance can imitate. She no longer fears standing apart from the crowd. She understands that every meaningful path eventually becomes lonely before it becomes liberating. She no longer asks the world for permission to exist as she truly is. She has already given that permission to herself. In that moment, fear loses its authority. The past loses its chains. The future loses its power to intimidate. Only the present remains. Clear. Steady. Whole. A woman who knows her worth does not pursue, she chooses.